Good morning. I look out at you guys and I wonder where we can start in the conversation so that we can move the ball to a different level. So for me, the starting place is, some of you have heard the discussion yesterday, probably most of you, and I want to underline the second part, funding the new economy, public banking, and the larger perspective that we're living in and where it might take us. So the question is whether we, and I'm posing this to you, kind of tossing it out and letting it sit there and simmer, can we get our heads around the notion that literally people like us meaning the person sitting in your seat and the one next to you, can transform and build an entirely new economy? Now, most people actually don't step up to that question. They kind of touch it. I'm just doing projects. I'm doing a little here. I'm doing a study group. I've got my project. And they don't self-conceive as a transformative person who actually takes responsibility. This is really nasty stuff. Takes responsibility personally for changing the entire system. So let that sit there. Can you ask yourself that? Because that's what this is about, by the way. Did you know that? That's what we're talking about. So let's get the frame clarified, not in general, but whether or not we, and that means individually, are willing to step up to the question, what I'm about is changing the whole system. Okay, so let that sit there, okay? Good. And then the second thing to do is how to listen to a talk like this one. And I urge you not to listen to this like a lecture. Don't take this as a lecture. The question is, what am I personally willing to do about what I hear? And do I agree with it, disagree with it? But if you listen to it as a lecture, like a college student or sitting in a lecture hall, you miss the point, okay? The question is always existential. What are we going to do with this? Rather than, isn't that interesting? Gosh, he said something interesting. I didn't know that. That's one way to look at it. The other way is, what in the world can I do with this information, really? So that's the starting point. That's the introduction of the sermon, right? Okay, we're in a religious kind of setting. It always does something to me. So let me start here. Those of you who were, most of you here last night? Yeah, okay, so I very briefly said some things about the relationship between new banking, public banking strategies, and the new economy. And I want to give you just a little bit more about that, and then talk about why this particular moment in history that we happen to live in may open the way for a transformative possibility. Now, when I say that, you know, I'll back away from the kind of opening existential remarks. I do want to remind you that I'm what used to be called in Washington a hard-nosed pol. That is to say, I've worked in real politics, running staffs in both the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, and doing policy planning at a pretty high level in the State Department. So I've been there, done that, been involved in real campaigns, and I don't say that the possibility of laying the groundwork for transforming the system is real. I don't say that lightly. And I would like you also to kind of look at that weird thing. Here's this guy, comes out of the straight world of real politics, and he says we can change the system. Just let it sit there in your lap. What do you do with that? Just look, you know, kind of look at it. What do I do with that? Maybe he just went off his rocker in the 60s or something like that. That's a possibility. So just let that piece sit there. But what I was saying last night, and I want to just elaborate a little bit about it, is that the reporting that we have, the journalism we have, simply doesn't tell us about all the things going on. And partly it is corporate domination of the media. Partly it is that they're never interested in locality. And partly they are financially strapped. So they just fire local reporters who do the reporting. So it's not surprising that we don't know all of the things that are going on. But I want to give you a sense both of what is going on and then a sense of some of the dynamics of what is happening in this larger framework called the new economy, and what we could, with a serious public banking strategy, what we could do to make it real. So I mentioned last night just some of the basic things that people don't know, that there are 130 million Americans involved in co-ops already, and that there's a rich experience, some good, some bad, that you can draw upon, both rural and urban, and there's an explosion of small-scale experimentation with worker co-ops around the country. That's happening in many parts of the country, almost totally unreported. I'll give you a website that does report on this and many other subjects like this that are things going on. It's called Community-Wealth. Put the dash in, www.community-wealth.org, and it's the best site that I've seen yet that reports on the great variety of things going on as best we can. It kind of brings together other websites for co-ops, worker-owned companies, land trusts, etc. So co-ops are a big piece of it. The credit union part of that I mentioned last night is another big piece of it. And for those of you who weren't here, I mentioned that the credit unions as a whole, as one person, one vote banks, have more capital than any of the big 5 banks in the New York Wall Street banking system, and that they are takeable, overable, because they're one person, one vote, and some people are beginning to try to move them into more creative work. They have some legal limitations, but they certainly rarely use what options they have to do more interesting investing. A third piece of this is the land trusts, and again, recapitulating, which is a nonprofit, democratized piece of the economy. All of these are democratic ownership structures in which the people get to decide what's going on. And I mentioned that the land trust idea was started in the 1960s as a way in rural Georgia, coming out of the civil rights movement, to start agricultural programs for poor black people who had been involved in civil rights. In Vermont and in western Massachusetts, it was land preservation, had an ecological bent. And now they're spreading all over the country in ways that democratize ownership of land, to control gentrification, to use the profits from, publicly using the profits from one part of the land rise to another part, and then subsidizing, cross-subsidizing low-income housing in that part of the new economy. And they're getting really even to another stage, and this takes it to an edge that you might think about for larger development as we go forward. It isn't simply that land trust, which is common ownership of land to achieve a public purpose, and it could be financed, one of the things we could really finance with the next banking system. There's another step forward. So if there's anything I'd like you to kind of get the glimmer of, is the dynamic processes that are involved as we build forward. So it used to be, all over the country, when the public made a big investment in something like mass transit or rail systems, there would be, at each exit, an increase in land values. And the land values would go to the developers, who would make the wealth out of it, and you'd then try to tax it back. Many parts of the country, we've advanced beyond that. Public banking and public ownership are similar themes here. And in many parts of the country, what now happens is after the public investment goes in, at these exits where the prices go up, the public land is now publicly owned. And then you rent it out or lease it out and capture the benefits again for a public purpose. The theme in all of this is one way or another beginning to capture benefits for public purposes, whether small neighborhoods, land trusts, cooperatives. The banking system as a whole is critical to the whole operation. Piece by piece, there is experimentation and development going on in many parts of the country. Another piece of this, and here's the dynamic part that's very interesting. I was involved in Youngstown, Ohio in late 1977. How many of you know about the Youngstown Steel story? All right, some of you do, some probably more of the Midwesterners. And here you get not only the expanding number of things going on, which is just in virtually every area that I'm kind of summarizing all too quickly here today, but here you get a different sense of dynamics. Over time, watch this closely, over time, not only increases in numbers that people are learning to do that is not reported by the press, but is happening and can be done anywhere. Not only over time increasing numbers of things happening that we can do and are doing, but increasing sophistication and new innovation and developing beyond the experimentation stage. So the Youngstown story, and for those of you who don't know, in 1977, one of the largest steel mills in the United States went down, Youngstown Sheet and Tube. One day, 5,000 people lost their jobs. Pink slips was what it was called. They all got pink slips. It was front page news on every major newspaper and on every major television story. That had not been happening in the United States. Happens all the time now, so it's not even in the press. And it was a gigantic shock in the Midwest and in Youngstown in particular. The Youngstown steelworkers and the religious coalition in that town pulled together and they said, why can't we set up this mill? Why don't we take it over? Why don't we set it up as a community/worker-owned steel mill? Interesting idea. Young guys, there's a sidelight. One of the guys who really put it forward, who thought this was a good idea, was taken aside by one of the people, one of the elders of the city, and said, if you're interested in steel mills, I think there's some stocks I could sell you that are much better than this old mill. But they weren't interested in that. They were interested in building forward, both in a way that saved jobs, solved practical problems, and developed, this is the thing to watch, and developed a different trajectory. That's what this is all about, laying groundwork to develop a different trajectory. So they began to organizing. They got the religious coalitions. They got the national political leadership wherever they could get it. They got the Carter administration to give them $200,000 to do a very sophisticated study. And I was they would call me in to actually oversee the study, but it was done by steel specialists around the country. They came up with a viable plan. And then the Carter administration pledged $200 million in loan guarantees to fund their plan. 5,000 people, large-scale worker ownership, community ownership, the same thematic that is essential to what we're talking about here in terms of public banking. And then after the election of 1978, not surprisingly, the money went away. But they understood, and this is an important piece of it, they understood that you're serious about transforming the banking system and the new economy, you're going to lose some battles. And you need to know that going in. The name of the game is very challenging. And if you understand that going in, as they did, you begin in advance preparing an educational program, a political effort, spreading the word. Even if you lose, you win, because you lay groundwork going forward if you know that's what you're doing. So raising the level of our sophistication becomes part and parcel of what we're talking about. And I am talking to the person in your seat again. How do we do that? Well, interestingly, in the state of Ohio, if you go around the state, there are more worker-owned companies now coming out of that battle and that educational process, probably per capita more than any state in the country. We don't know that for sure, but the statistics aren't available. And some professor got excited about it and set up a little center at Kent State University, technical assistance, and he began building up these companies with sophistication so they were viable worker-owned businesses. And you see them expanding. Long story short, over time, the sophistication has developed, and in the city of Cleveland, some of you know that there's another step that's been taken, and there will be more and more. But in Cleveland, there's a complex now coming out of this developmental path, keep your eye on the developmental path, a complex of advanced community-owned, worker-owned companies, large scale, linked together in the fashion of the Mondragon Corporation. Some of you know about this very sophisticated Mondragon cooperatives, 85,000 in the Basque country of Spain, linked together with a revolving fund so that they kick in some of their profits into the fund and then they start new worker-owned companies. There's also a nonprofit corporation. These are not set up separately. They're to build the community. They can't get up and go. You can't sell out. They're structured so that part of the profits go into building the community and building a land trust and using the profits in that direction as well. And the model is sophisticated, and by the way, we're not talking about little co-ops only. They just opened 3 months ago the largest urban greenhouse in the United States. 3 million heads of lettuce a year. And I learned that to do that, it's 26,000 plantings every single day to get to 3 million. That's how you do it. So it's a big deal. There's the greenest industrial scale laundry in that part of the country services hospitals and nursing homes. This is in a neighborhood, 40% unemployment, almost entirely black, average family income of $18,000. But the model is very, very sophisticated. And the third one is a solar installation company, and they're online to put in 1 or 2 new companies a year. Again, look at the sophistication and the developmental trajectory beyond. It isn't only that these are freestanding worker-owned companies, but they give you an idea of how people are beginning to advance the ball. That neighborhood has in it some of the most important medical facilities, maybe in the world. Cleveland Clinic is in the middle of this poor neighborhood. University Hospital is there, Case Western Reserve University. Those 3 institutions, this is true in almost every city. They are anchored. They can't go anywhere like the big corporations. They're called anchor institutions. You can do this anywhere, and people are. These 3 institutions purchase $3 billion, with a B, dollars in goods and services a year, in addition to their salaries, in addition to the construction. None of it from this neighborhood. And almost all of it has substantial taxpayer financing, Medicare, Medicaid, educational funds. So the light bulb that's gone on in this advancing trajectory of sophistication, why not use some of the purchasing power to rebuild and stabilize and expand these sophisticated, large-scale, and all of this, by the way, at the top level of green in every dimension. That's, by definition, that's the starting point and the ending point. Nothing gets by without being. It's in a platinum LEED building, the laundry, they use about 1/3 of the heat, 1/3 of the water, etc. The notion now of targeting some of this funding to help stabilize and rebuild the new economy is an advance that gives stability to the new form. Now, I could go at length to that discussion, but the ball to keep your eye on here, if you're thinking about the new economy and public banking and where all this might go, is not simply what I call projectism. I'm very much for projects. I'm very much against projectism. My project is neat, ain't it nice? Let's do my project only. What's interesting is the historical possibility of developing more and more power and more sophistication and more movement building. So let me say just a word about the movement building side of this. In 1977, when the steelworkers at the local level in Youngstown tried to set up this steel company, and they had the religious coalitions and their politics, the international union, the steelworkers union, was totally against it. Publicly, privately, they probably went to the Carter administration to kill the money, along with the big corporations. They didn't want these upstart organizers and activists and religious types to get in their way. They wanted to run the old steelworkers union in the way they always had run it, and they probably were one of the key factors in stopping it. That's 1977. There also has been evolution there. Now the international steelworkers are the primary proponents of worker community ownership and worker co-ops and unionized co-ops. So, yeah, exactly. But notice, if you want to play this game, keep your eye on the developmental ball and understand what you're doing is developing over time and laying groundwork so other unions can join, and indeed a number of them are. And it's the developmental process that is involved in historical change that is the thing of interest here. That is what happens over time if people are serious about what you're doing and laying groundwork. I often say, I may have said it here at a different point in time, but it's another way to get at the central issue that I want to open this discussion with, that my heroes, my genuine heroes, are the civil rights workers in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s. It was very dangerous. Many were killed, many were tortured. But the people who laid the groundwork without which the civil rights movement could not happen were those early people. And to a certain degree, much less dangerous. Look around the folks you got in this room. There are a lot of serious people here who are interested in laying the groundwork both for transforming the entire banking system in the most powerful corporate capitalist system in the history of the world. That's what this is about. That's why you're here. And transforming the system in the direction we call the new economy, and that the central characteristic of it is democratizing and ecologically sustainable. So think about those folks in Mississippi when you think about what we might do and what it takes to personally say, I personally am engaged in the process of transforming the whole system. Whoa. So that's the other, it's another way to get at the perspective problem that we're talking about here. Now let me put on my historian's hat. I wear these two hats, and it's very funny. Sometimes they get in the way of each other. But I hopefully keep them in the back of my head so I can see ahead. As a historian, I'm very cool about when historical change is possible. And I would urge that we not be naive about this. There are periods of history when nothing moves, when it is not possible to lay groundwork, when you can't change anything, when the system doesn't move at all. So it's important to begin to get a pretty clear sense of, are we in a context, I'll use a term, does the emerging historical context into which we are living our lives offer us options to lay down the foundations of a transformation, or is it closed? What's it like? How do we get a handle on that? And how do we get a cool handle? Not just a kind of, oh, ain't that interesting, you can do anything anytime. There's a lot of work to do anytime, but what's it like? Are we facing a context that opens a door that we could push further and further? Are we able to, in the emerging historical context, genuinely lay down the possibility of a transformation beyond? Is that our time in history? Is our time in history capable of allowing that? My own sense is that just possibly, for a variety of reasons, we are in fact entering a period where there are enormous possibilities for people who want to get serious about what we're talking about at this conference. And the reasons are several. I worked in the House and Senate, I mentioned earlier, at the peak of progressive liberal power. That's when you could pass the war on poverty, you could pass the environmental protection bills, you could pass Medicare, you could pass Medicaid, the war on poverty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That moment of history, which people kind of look back at and say, what happened? But if you see it as a distinct moment that passed for certain reasons, you get a handle on why there may be new conditions generating a context and a possibility, and indeed openings for different kind of change. So let me say a word about that. Many historians are now coming to see the period 1933 to about 1970, the middle part of the 20th century, into which the 1960s were the peak, as a passing aberration in American history. Think about that. That whole period that we took for granted as the way forward, many people took for granted, as an aberration, created first by the great crisis of the worldwide depression of the 1930s that happened to have, by chance, a Republican conservative in office so that Democrats could blame him, Hoover, and then move the ball in a liberal direction. Had it been by chance that a Democrat was in office, the Republican right wing would have taken it over. Throughout Europe, fascism took over. But by chance, building a labor movement, passing the laws that were passed, Social Security, the banking laws, the various efforts throughout that period, particularly in labor law, was very important, the agricultural laws. All of that happened in that moment, and it also strengthened, this is an important historical point, it strengthened the labor movement. The labor movement was 11% of the labor force in 1929. by passing the Wagner Act and Section 7A legislation of the 1930s by chance in that moment. I'm emphasizing that chance moment. The labor movement got powerful, and World War II was the second big event that we all sort of take for granted historically. It's an oddity that happened in the middle of the 20th century. World wars are, well, there it was, happened to strengthen the United States and destroy all of our major competitors for a while, until they came back. Germany, Japan, France, Italy. And that moment was the peak moment of the 1960s, when we had world domination, we had a strong labor movement backing liberal politics, and you could do things that were an aberration. Strange notion that that context that we took for granted may have been an aberration. That can move you in a pessimistic direction, or it can open you to a very different discussion. And what I said yesterday, what I liked about the way this discussion opened up, we were treating each other as adults to serious considerations of the banking system, very sophisticated issues were posed, and the historical development issue I'm trying to urge you to come to terms with is how interesting and important the change in context is for what we want to do. So let me take another step forward in this experiment with talking to the person in your seat. The labor movement has gone from 34% of the labor force, 34.5 at its peak. It was always weak. The Swedes are at 85%, which is the backing of the kind of politics that was liberal politics. It's down to 11% now. The whole era of politics that solved problems by trying to regulate, by trying to pass, that era it's not just the Republicans in the House. The trends for 30 years of income distribution, of wealth distribution, of ecological destruction, of CO2 production are 30-year trends. The top, another one, for instance, the top 1% has gone from 10% of the income to 20% of the income over 30 years, meaning the bottom 99% have gone. The trend in CO2 production is 30% up since 1970. Into the matter of liberty itself, watch this one. We don't have many black and brown people in the audience. That's our problem, not theirs. This is about them, mostly. The percentage of people in the United States who lose their liberty, democracy, liberty, equality, our great values, has gone from about 85 per 100,000. It's gone up to sevenfold, 7 times that number over 30 years per 100,000. We are 8 times as many people per capita in prison losing their liberty than any other advanced system in this decaying period. Liberty, if you ask people about democracy 35 years ago, the polls would all say, of course, we trust our representatives. They do what we want. If you ask them now, they say they just go to Washington and represent the special interests. There has been a radical shift in the trend line that has lost the old movement and the old possibility, the great liberal moment. Now, if you're sitting there, you're probably wondering, what in the world does this tell me? That's a very pessimistic story. In one dimension, it is. That entire system is declining, but what is happening in the wake of the decline, and this is the interesting thing if we rise to the level of historical understanding of who we might be, it is opening up questions that people have not faced for 30, 40, 50 years. It is saying somehow there needs to be a transformation much deeper than the aberrant moment. There needs to be a change in the power relationships. There needs to be a fundamental shift on ecological issues. There needs to be something deeper. And the thing to think about is not only our values that people understand, but that the context is forcing people to ask deeper and deeper and deeper questions. Think about that. It's not every time in history when the context is forcing people to ask different questions and urging them either you do something new or the pain continues and gets worse. Either you do something new or the pain continues and gets worse. That kind of a context is a context where more and more people, not just us, are wondering what's going on here. How do we move the ball in a different direction? That's an emerging context where much tougher questions get asked, where people begin asking questions about the entire banking system much deeper, where they begin the experimentation like the Youngstown stories, but in every area. We're now about to build, 20 states have introduced one form or another legislation on public banking. Throughout the country, we're seeing more and more experimentation with worker-owned companies. The healthcare system, as I mentioned last night, is another big piece of this. There's a big experimentation going on and development because of the problems that can't be solved the old way. There is a beginning context in which people are grappling with much deeper problems and beginning the necessary experimental and political work to make that happen. You probably didn't think you're going to get a historical talk this morning. I think it is really important for us to understand that we are not just interested in projects, that the people who come to play here down deep are not just projectists who are interested in projectism. There is a challenge: how does this whole system become a new economy and a new democracy? And for that, we need to begin to get a sense not only of who we are, but whether the context we are entering is likely to keep deepening and deepening and deepening the questions people cannot avoid confronting. And my suggestion to you is that's what we're entering. I consider it potentially, and I say this carefully as a historian, potentially the most important period in American history, bar none. Let me say that again. Are you crazy? The most, and that's including the American Revolution and the Civil War and World War II. What? What? I'm delighted to have an applause line, but I'm asking you to think that you may live in the most important period of American history, the possible prehistory of a great transformation. And I'll say very briefly a bit more about that, very briefly, because I want to go on to some other things. But the 19th century was largely about solving big problems that could not be solved. The elites could not solve the problems of a growing farm and material workers context, but they could throw land at it, moving west right across the continent, taking the land from the Indians, as it were, oversimplified. Whenever there's a problem, you could still go west, take more land. The short way of saying is that whenever there was a big problem, you threw land at it until you ran out of continent. And in the 20th century, oversimplified, but we could get into a long discussion, I'm sure we will at another point. In the first quarter of the century, there was massive decay and World War II. World War I solved the problem. In the second part of the century, the Depression did not end. It was deepening again in 1938, and World War II solved the problem. In the third quarter of the century, Korea, Vietnam, the military budgets of the Cold War, et cetera, and the moment when we didn't have competitors because World War II destroyed them, solved the problem. We're entering the period where, because of nuclear weapons, massive war is no longer possible. We may destroy ourselves, but continental war, using 40% of the economy, 7 times the stimulus of the Obama program, World War II was, is not likely to happen. Military spending is large, but it's going down to 3% of the economy. It was 42% in World War II. It was 13% in the Korean War. We are entering a period where we ran out of land in the 19th century to solve our problems, and we're running out of big war to solve our problems. It is good, but it means that the decaying system in which we are living has lost its capacity, either through war or land or through a temporary politics, to solve problems sort of in the old way. And it opens the question of what then is the new way. as the title of my book, What Then Must We Do? And what people are beginning to do because of the emerging context is ask much deeper questions, develop much more sophisticated answers, beginning to really go to the heart of the banking system, beginning to look at what different ways of ownership that are democratized, beginning to look at land trust, beginning in virtually every area, there is an explosion both of experimentation and of new thinking, and of not trusting the standard line, and of questioning, and of learning, and of becoming ecologically sophisticated, and beginning to deal with these things in a different way that brings in more and more people. Gender issues are beyond the table. There are an opening in the prehistory of the possible next great transformation. There is a deeper questioning than has ever occurred in American history, and the experimentation that we and folks in this room are involved with, and the concerns here, are the kinds of concerns that go right to the heart of the system. That is to say, you change the banking system in the way that we're talking about in public banking, you are talking about taking a big piece of a new direction for a system that could be democratic, ecologically sustainable, egalitarian, and a whole different vision of where we go in the next century. Are you really up to that? No, I'm asking you if you can really get your heads around, did I come to a conference, because it's a lot of interest in speakers, meet some friends, or did I come to here to think about, am I personally willing to actually look in the mirror and say, who, me? Change the system? Lay the groundwork in the difficult prehistory of the next transformation? You guys up to that? I think that's why you're here. I think that's why I'm here. I know that's why I'm here, and I know that's why lots of folks are here, and I know that's why this conference is here. And I want to suggest to you that what we haven't done to ourselves, see, this is the interesting part. We haven't actually said to ourselves, and then to each other, but more important to ourselves, that's what I'm about, and that's why I'm here. So we need to explicate, I love this language, we need to explicate the implicit. That's why you are here. But making it real by identifying what the nature of what we're about really is, then permits us to talk honestly with each other about what it's all about and how we actually proceed and how difficult it is and how challenging, and how the Youngstown story tells you what we're going to lose a lot of battles, a lot of experimentations, but explicating the implicit, facing up to why actually people would come here like us, and raising the ante a little bit for us personally, doing it to yourself when you look in that mirror, that permits us then, I think, to step out in a very, very different way. There's an extremely exciting list of people who are going to be talking for the next 2 days. There's going to be very sophisticated and important information. There's a powerful political challenge of building and a moral challenge. I'm delighted to be part of it, and I'm delighted to be part of a group like you all, who I know who you are. Thank you very much.